Kunja Vihari Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Gopi Jana Balaba Giri Varadhari Gopi Jana Balaba Giri
We're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 5th chapter, text number 19. Is that right? Text number 19, or text, 19? Is that right? Night Chach Chitram Tvai Shatar Vadarayana Viryate Viryaje Grihito Nanya Bhavena Yat Tasya Harir Ishvaraha Naicha Chitram Tvai Kshatar Vadarayana Viryajate Grihito Nanya Bhavena Yatvaya Harir Ishvaraha Achaita Titam Dvaya Kshatar Vadarayana Viryaje Krito Nanya Bhavena Yatvaya Harir Ishvaraha Na Never Etat Such inquiries. Chitram, very wonderful. Tvai, in you. Kshataha, O Vidura. Vadarayana, of Vyasadeva. Viryaje, born from the semen. Grihitaha, accepted. Ananya Bhavena, without deviation from the thought. Yat, because. Tvaya, by you. Harihi, the personality of Godhead. Ishvaraha, the Lord. O Vidura, translation. O Vidura, it is not at all wonderful that you have so accepted the Lord without deviation of thought. For you were born from the semen of Vyasadeva. Purport. The value of great parentage and noble birth is evaluated here in connection with the birth of Vidura. The culture of a human being begins when the father invests his semen in the womb of the mother. According to his status of work, a living entity is placed in a particular father's semen, and because Vidura was not an ordinary living entity, he was given the chance to be born from the semen of Vyasa. The birth of a human being is a great science, and therefore reformation of the act of impregnation according to the Vedic ritual is called Garbhodana Samskara. It is very important for generating good population. The problem is not to check the growth of the population, but to generate good population on the level of Vidura, Vyasa, and Maitreya. There is no need to check the growth of population if the children are born as human beings with all precautions regarding their birth. So-called birth control is not only vicious, but also useless. The verse again by Srila Prabhupada, O Vidura, it is not at all wonderful that you have so accepted the Lord without deviation of thought, for you were born from the semen of Vyasadeva. It's not actually, the translation is not actually by the translation is by Prabhupada, but the verse is by Vyasadeva. So Prabhupada here is talking about the value of great parentage and noble birth. So there does seem to be a genetic dimension to birth. When Gopinath Pattanayaka was condemned to be punished to death, Lord Chaitanya was asked to intervene, but he refused to do it because he said that he didn't want to talk to the king because he was a pounds, shilling, pence man. And finally, after several entreaties, Lord Chaitanya agreed to intervene, and Gopinath Pattanayaka was saved from the punishment of death, from being executed, from being thrown on upraised swords. The thing is that the king, once he learned that Gopinath Pattanayaka was condemned to death, and he was related to Bhavananda Roy and Ramananda Roy, he said that anyone who is related to the Roy family, Bhavananda Roy and Ramananda Roy, is a special person. So this is genetically addressing the genetics of the situation, because and then the king, I don't know, this is narrated in Chaitanya Chaitamrita and other places, was very merciful to Gopinath Pattanayaka, and he said he wasn't aware that his son, the king's son, the prince, had condemned him to death. And the thing is that Gopinath Pattanayaka was doing something illicit or wrong. He was a tax collector, and he was keeping some of the money for himself. He wasn't giving it all to the government. So the king said, all I wanted to do was, King Patraparuta, all I wanted to do was realize the money. I didn't want him to be condemned to death, but he had a conflict with the prince, so the prince condemned him to death. It was a very brutal kind of death. They were thrown onto upraised swords. It was like in previous times the methods were very, very brutal. Of course, they're not any less brutal nowadays. The electric chair and the gas chamber, they're very painful. Their death is very painful, but they were also very brutal in those days. So the point is that Maharaj Patraparuta said that anyone who's related to Bhavananda and Ramananda Roy is a friend of mine. So he not only stopped him from being executed, he called it off at the last moment, just as he was about to die, and he said that he could be reinstated as a tax collector, provided he gave him the money. And he wouldn't have to do it straight away, but he could do it a little at a time. So he was not only exonerated from punishment, but he was reinstated in his original position as tax collector, and given a very nice wrapper. So the king realized that because he was related to Bhavananda and Ramananda Roy, that he was a special person, that there was a genetic involvement. And as Prabhupada writes, the culture of a human being begins when the father invests his semen in the womb of the mother. According to his status of work, a living entity is placed in a particular father's semen, and because Vidura was not an ordinary living entity, he was given the chance to be born from the semen of Vyasa. So when he says that Vidura was not an ordinary living entity, the history of Vidura is that he was, in a previous lifetime, a Yamaraj. He was actually Yamaraj, who is very intelligent, because he is able to read the minds of all people in the whole universe. It is thought that mind reading is a very special quality, but people who are very advanced materially, like Yamaraj, and they're not ordinary, could do these things. And therefore, although he was condemned to death by Madhava Muni for being too harsh with his judgment, because when he was a small child, he did something to an insect. He inserted a straw and tortured this small insect, and for that he was punished. And so Vidura amalgamated the punishment, or he reduced the punishment so that he would have to take birth in the material world from a Sudra as a Sudra. But he took birth from the semen of Vyasadeva in one of his wives, who was a maidservant, a Sudra. So he was given a special concession, even though he was not ordinary. And then Prabhupada goes on to say that the problem is not to check the growth of population, but to generate good population on the level of Vidura, Vyasa, and Maitreya. And then in somewhere, Prabhupada is talking about the concept of overpopulation being wrong or being faulty. And when Drudakarma and I were doing some research in the Divine Nature book, we learned that if you took all of to debunk the whole overpopulation theory, we learned that all the people in the planet at that time, it was maybe it was 1996, so it was about 40 years ago. The population was a lot smaller, but even then, the entire population of the world would fit into the country of France with a lot of space left over. Each person would have several square meters of room to themselves. So the idea that overpopulation is outstripping the food supply is a faulty concept. Not long ago, when I was I traveled a lot in airplanes, but I was flying over the United States, and you could see that most of the country was uninhabited. Most people were living in big cities like New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Detroit, but most of the land was vacant. So people have migrated into the big cities, and rural existence is kind of ill thought of. But now when people confront the rural situation, they are enlivened. Actually, there's no overpopulation, but there seems to be a shortage of food, and the shortage is because the Earth, who's actually a person, is actually a female, the personification of Earth, which we will read later when Prithu Maharaj addresses her. She withholds her bounty. So the restriction is not due to too many people, but due to the Earth's realizing there's too much sin going on, and therefore she is withholding the vegetables and fruits and grains. It's being withheld. And it's a very interesting concept that something is being withheld by higher powers. Once Prabhupada said that we are sometimes amazed at how much water is evaporated by the sun. When you consider that the sun is over the oceans, and there's a huge amount of water evaporated from the oceans, and yet there's very little rainfall. In fact, we're now experiencing drought in many parts of the world. And what happens is, according to what Prabhupada has said, is that the sun withholds it steals the water. It withholds the water, and there's not very many clouds over the ocean, but in the proper setting, the water forms into clouds, and the clouds then rain down, and they form rivers, and the rivers flow to the ocean, and the water is then evaporated, and clouds are formed. But the sun, or the sun god, steals the water, steals the clouds, and when there's less sin, and when he actually wants to release the water, he does so. Clouds are formed, and rainfall is exhibited. So these are some of the unseen factors of what goes on in the higher realms of the world. There was a person, an economist, he was also a clergyman, named Robert Thomas Malthus, who predicted in about 1804, thereabouts, that the population of the world would outstrip the food supply. So this was like hundreds of years ago when this alarm was sounded. And when I was in school, I was about 10 years old, and we were treated to a film that showed that the topsoil of the United States was being washed away. And many years ago, books were written about ecology and how the topsoil was being ruined, and how there wasn't enough food, and all this sort of thing was going on. And now today it's become a cause célèbre, a sort of a very popular notion that there's not enough food. And there's companies that make what they call terminator seeds, so that farmers who ordinarily take the seeds out of plant. We know that, like figs, for example, and tomatoes have a lot of little grains inside them, and it's been a custom for farmers to keep those seeds, those little grains, and plant them later, and they will grow into large trees, like banyan trees and tomato trees and so on and so forth. So now some companies that specialize in selling seeds to the farmers are making seeds that can't reproduce. In other words, the tomato seeds and the fig seeds cannot produce trees any longer. And they're called terminator seeds. And this is because they would like the farmers to purchase more seeds from that company. So this is very demonic. And their rationalization, their justification is that there's not enough food to go around. So one of the things that they're considering to do, I mean, I'm talking about the evils of Kali Yuga now, is to irradiate food and to subject them to atomic radiation. So, and they say that then there will be enough. But it's known, and I saw on a poster, it was in the form of a cloth poster. It had a picture on it of a human being that had 6 fingers. So the idea was, and there was a slogan underneath that said, "This is the result of irradiation." So this concept of irradiation causes birth defects, among other things, and it's a very unhealthy thing. So this is what is going on now. These big companies that make terminator seeds are also thinking to irradiate food so there will be enough for everyone. But Prabhupada says that overpopulation is a myth, and he talks about this in great detail. And he says so-called birth control is not only vicious but also useless. So the thing is that one cannot control birth and death, even though there are many attempts in the form of contraceptives and other methods to stop birth. The population is increasing. It's almost doubled in the last 30 or 40 years, the population of Earth. It's something like 9 billion people. And despite the fact that there are so many methods of birth control in the form of medicines and more natural methods, the population, it's impossible to stop birth. It's just like it's impossible to stop death. When Prabhupada was asked once why the death rate in India is so low or so high, he said it's the same everywhere. It's 100% or 1,000%. People have to die, people have to get born, and there's no stopping it. So the idea of overpopulation, and this is one of the things that devotees can comment on popular notions of the world, that there's an overpopulation, that it's not true. There's not the statistics can be proven. It can be shown that if we take the whole population and the square meterage or footage of a country like France, we can see that everyone can fit into that and still have a lot of room. So the idea of overpopulation is a great myth. So there are a lot of challenges that Krishna consciousness faces. Among them, false propaganda that's being perpetrated. When Drita Karma and I were writing this book, we encountered a devotee, and I've decided one of my projects is to make a film about the challenges of manifest destiny of the Hare Krishna movement. It's kind of a checkered destiny. There's been some bad things that have happened, and there's also been some good things that have happened. The bad things were the deprogramming movement, the attempt by governments to stop worship in the temple. The good things are celebrating 50 years of incorporation in the Sydney Opera House. All these things are going on. So there's both bad things and good things. And as Prabhupada said, that every human being is known for his or her glories and faults. So there was a time when, and I think this was in about 1972 or 73, when a devotee was kidnapped, literally by her parents. And I tried to track her down, and I've spent about 6 weeks trying to track her down, and she lives in Colorado Springs, California. And so it was a very long and interesting story about this kidnapping and how her parents kidnapped her. And they spirited her, and she, when she was about 18 or 19 years old, she joined the Krishna consciousness movement. And her name was Kulapriya. And she phoned me and said, my parents want to see me. But I'm a little bit suspicious because they've never come to see me. I've been living in the temple here for quite a few months, and my parents haven't come to see me. So I'm a little bit suspicious of them wanting to see me now, and why I have to come to them, to their house, instead of them coming to me. And so my advice to her was that, well, if you stay together with your fiance, she had a fiance then, and you don't separate under any conditions, then I think you'll be relatively safe. So the two of them went to the door. The parents lived in a place called Arcadia, California, which is a suburb of Pasadena, California. You've probably heard of Pasadena. And she went to the door, and the mother looked very distraught. I don't know if she was crying crocodile tears or whatever, but she was very distraught. And she said to the fiance, "I just want to see my daughter alone for a few moments. And then you can come in, both of you." So he kind of like accepted that as being true, which it really wasn't, and he went back to his car out in front of the house. It was in Arcadia, California, which is a very kind of like upmarket suburb of the United States. And while he was back in his car, her brother, named Shad, we called him Shad the Bad, tried to open the hood and disable the car so it couldn't go anywhere, because he didn't want her fiance to know what was going to happen next. Well, what we found out later, what did happen next, was that she looked around at the assembled parents and sister and brother, and realized that something wasn't normal. They said, well, the first thing she said to them is, "Where's Granny?" Because they got her to come on the plea that her grandmother was critically ill. So she said, "Where's Granny?" And they said, "Well, we have to go to the hospital because she's in intensive care and she can't go anywhere." So she, at that point, realized that something was not kosher, something was up, something was wrong, and she headed for the door, which she came in. And just as she was about to leave, she opened the door to leave. Several hands grabbed her, including the mother and father and brother, and pulled her back in the house. This is we learned later on. I mean, and this was witnessed by her fiance, who was in the automobile outside the house, and this guy gave up on trying to disable the car. He just tried to pull out the distributor wires or something, and he was unsuccessful. But anyway, he just thought, well, I tried. So what happened, and we found out later, was they blindfolded her, and they sat on her, and they covered her with some kind of quilt, and went out the back way of the house, and turned out all the lights. And they got into a van, and they put her in the van, laying down, not able to see what was going on, or move around. And they drove out the back way, out the driveway, up to a place called Calistoga, California, which is about 30 or 40 kilometers north of Los Angeles, and to deprogram her. And so the parents had paid for deprogrammers to come from Ardmore, Pennsylvania, which is on the other side of the country, which is on the other. It's quite a long distance away from Los Angeles, and there were two women that were experienced deprogrammers, because deprogramming was a bit of a phenomenon in those days. They called it deprogramming. It was a way to get people to renounce their faith if they joined something that was not popular. And so after about 4 or 5 days of intensive brainwashing, they tried to brainwash her to think that what she joined, that the Hare Krishna movement was an evil thing. She convinced the deprogrammers that she was, in fact, deprogrammed, and that she was going to renounce her faith, but she really wasn't. And so she said, "I just have to walk to get out and get some fresh air and clear my head, and please let me go out and walk, because I think that everything you said is true." And so they let her go. And as soon as she looked back, and as soon as she got out of sight of the house, she made a run for it. And this was like 4 days later from the day of the kidnapping. And she made a run for it, and the first thing she did is she ran to a road, and the first thing she saw was an automobile coming, and it was a police car, and she thought, well, the police maybe know about this whole thing, and they're going to return her back to get deprogrammed. And she dove into a ditch on the side of the road, hiding from the police. And the police kind of thought, well, wasn't there someone, a young woman that we saw on the road a little while back? Shouldn't we go back and see what was the problem? So they went back and they found her. And then she told them the whole story. And then they were sympathetic. And the next thing that they did was they drove her to a house. She had some other relatives in that area. And she asked if she could use the phone. And she phoned the temple in Los Angeles and called the devotees and told them that she was now free of the deprogrammers and they could come and get her. So then the police were there and they heard all this. And so they contacted the police in Los Angeles, which was a long distance away. And somehow or other, they flew up in a private airplane. This was in the days when there was a lot of money around, so it wasn't a big deal to have a private airplane, for a police force to have a private airplane. So they flew her back to Los Angeles at night, and she came back and she was freed. And then there was a very jubilant celebration that she was freed and got back. And it was a very high-profile thing, because when the house was all dark, we didn't know what had happened. And the devotees had taken turns of keeping cars out in front of the house, this black house, thinking that maybe we didn't know what happened to her. Maybe they killed her or something. And on the way back, we stopped this was on a Saturday night. So on the way back, we thought, well, we'll make this a high-profile case, so we'll stop at the newspaper. It was the Los Angeles Times. And because it was a Saturday night, no one was there, and no one was working. So we drove the car into the basement, and there was the only person there was a guard in a little kiosk, and he said, well, there's nobody here. He said, you can go up onto the fourth floor and look around, but I don't think you'll find anybody there. So we went up I was with another devotee named Rameshwar, and then there was one person there sitting at a desk, and this person knew a lawyer. They were on a first-name basis. And what happened at the police department, when we went to the police, they said, well, if she had been my daughter, and I would have done the same thing, kidnapped her and tried to deprogram her. So she said, if you want to, the police said, if you want to make a complaint, you have to put it in writing and give it to us, and then we'll figure it out. So then we went into the nearest phone booth, which was in the police station. This is in the day before cell phones existed, and phoned our lawyer. And he said, you should, if you're going to file a complaint, you should do it in triplicate. I want a copy, and you should keep a copy exactly as you're submitted. So, because it was a Saturday night, everything was shut, everything was closed. But we did find one supermarket that had a stationery department with pencils and paper and carbon paper. So we got all the stuff that we needed, and tried to write out our complaint. And we said it was a kidnapping, and it was about a 4 or 5 page long thing with triplicate. And we gave it to the police. And the next morning, Sunday morning, back at the temple, there was a meeting of the BBT heads of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust publishing house. And that meeting turned into a session to find out how to free this woman who had been kidnapped. And so what happened was the heads of all the publishing house conducted the art department. There was a big art department at that time in Los Angeles. They were painting all the paintings that you see in the first set of Srimad Bhagavatams. And they made placards, that big placards, like 20 by 20, 25 inches or half a meter by half a meter tall, or a meter tall by half a meter wide. And so we decided to picket the place, and we phoned the lawyer who was up, and he said, well, it's all right to walk in front of the house but there's no sidewalk there. We told him. He said, well, it's all right as long as you stay close to the curb. It's legal. So we were parading with about 6 devotees that were in the art department. They wore non-devotional clothes, and they had these picket signs that said something like, are slavens torturing their daughter, or had they kidnapped their daughter? We didn't know what was going on because the house was still black. And the writer at the Los Angeles Times said, this is an interesting story. I think I'm going to write something about this. So on Monday morning, the following Monday, he not only wrote it, But there was a picture. I don't know what page it was on. Maybe it was on the front page. It showed a picture of people picketing in front of this house. Anyway, she was returned and safely, and that's a long. I just told a summary of the whole story, but that's a kind of a long story. Anyway, that's what happened in those days when there were some bad things going on, when the deprogramming movement was going on, and then to bring an end to this story, in 1976 or 77, when Prabhupada was in India, there was another deprogramming case that was going on in the other side of the country, and it went to court, and the court ruled that the so-called cult had brainwashed this lady, and then it was taken on appeal to the appellate court in Queens, New York, and that judge ruled in favor of the Krishnas and said that the lower court judgment was incorrect. And in the first paragraph, he said that the Hare Krishna movement is a bona fide religion that goes back thousands of years. It has roots in India, and it was read to Prabhupada because it appeared from the New York Times. It appeared in the Times of India the next day, and on the front page. And it was read to him, and Prabhupada said that what I thought was going to take 10 years only took a few, or 20 years, only took a few moments. And he was very pleased with this judgment. And the judgment was in favor of ISKCON. So that was more or less the end of the deprogramming movement in the United States. I mean, it wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the end. So that actually happened. So are there any comments or questions? I think I've gone a little over time. Yes, Srikanth?
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you for the class.
In this purport, Prabhupada is talking about a matter which is obviously subject to controversy, which is the idea of overpopulation, and elsewhere Prabhupada also takes the stance that we never went to the moon. These are subjects of controversy, but at the same time we know Prabhupada, when the devotees were at Ahobilam, where Nrsimhadev, they said Nrsimhadev appeared in the pillar there, and that was subject of controversy. Prabhupada said to take a neutral stance. So we see that there's two approaches that have been taken by Prabhupada. Obviously it's very difficult for us to understand. And then even now, in our current circumstance, there are a number of matters that are subject to controversy, obviously increasing exponentially. When do we know Prabhupada has taken stances in some cases and not in other cases? What do we learn from that? How can do we ourselves as devotees, do we come to a position where we do call out some things that are inhibiting the Krishna consciousness movement?
Well, generally things are decided on a case-by-case basis. Like some people would probably say that your wearing a beard and hair is not proper. Some people, I wouldn't say it, but the Prabhupada said that we have to discuss the concept of unity and diversity, and every year it should be discussed by the leaders of the movement in Mayapur. So the thing is that everything is decided on a case-by-case basis. Like we didn't have the picture of the ruin on the cover of Back to Godhead because Prabhupada decided that was too controversial to touch. But on the other hand, it was the deprogramming movement was controversial, and Prabhupada didn't like it. And he said that it's not brainwashing, but what we're doing is not brainwashing; it's brain cleaning. And then he went on to defy the whole movement, which was at that time very popular. So it was on a case-by-case basis. Some things are controversial and worth fighting. And then in the Bhaktivedanta manner, there was a government ruling that public worship was not allowed in that building because the zoning laws had only allowed it to be a theological college, because that's what it was before. And then they said to have public worship of people coming there was wrong. And it went on for 10 years. There was a battle. And it reached such proportions, such a high-profile proportion, that once when I wasn't there the whole time. I was traveling back and forth between the United States and England a lot. And I was told that when I went through immigration in England, I was asked by the agent, well, what's happening with the banner? she saw that I was wearing devotional clothes and that I had a tilak and shaved head and all that. And that was the first question she asked, what's going on with the matter? Because it was it was on television, it was in the newspapers, and ultimately we won the case. But it took something like 10 years, and we had lost all the court cases, including the Court of Human Rights, which refused to hear it in The Hague, in Holland. But somehow or other, that's another story. Well, we won the case. But it was very controversial because Prabhupada didn't like the idea of not being allowed to worship in public. And the person who headed this case said that well, the people of India, there's thousands of people, and that the Indian population in England is probably the greatest in the world of all countries except for maybe India and Pakistan. And somehow or other, he didn't. What happened was, just before the final ruling, the Indian population decided to make a protest, and without our having anything to do with it, they decided. There was about 50,000 of them descended on this underground station called Holborn, which is a major underground station in England. And from there, they went on foot. It's a very short distance to Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament. And there they staged this enormous protest, and the police were carrying old ladies away. I mean, this is on film. They were carrying old Hindu ladies away because they thought it was wrong that they were protesting. So this reached those kinds of proportions. Anyway, the case was won, and today the manor is it's going to be soon celebrating its 50th anniversary, and it's going very well. So these are some of the controversial things that are accepted, and some that are not accepted, and it's just on a case-by-case basis, as far as I can see.
Should we be placing the idea of, like you said, unity, diversity, and the idea of neutrality above?
Well, there's no sort of black and white, hard and fast rule. I mean, it can be discussed, but Prabhupada said it should be discussed every year. So the concept of simultaneously one and difference, achintya beta beta tattva, is kind of like unity and diversity. It's not a simple thing. And the GBC will probably have to rule on each case one by one. I mean, until maybe, though, they'll establish a policy which says that certain things, certain controversies are worth fighting against, and certain things should be ignored.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. When I can understand about what you're saying about the deprogramming movement, minimizing or disregarding Srila Prabhupada's teachings, and also I remember watching a film about a personality called Frances Farmer, who was earlier in the century, who had been deprogrammed, and the result was that they performed a lobotomy on her.
And what was the last thing you said about farmers?
There was a lady called Frances Farmer, and she was also considered to be, she was deprogrammed because of her, she was very creative. It was a little bit earlier in the century, so she had been sort of seen a social threat. So the result was that they used to perform lobotomies, like remove some creative aspect in the brain. So you could understand that, at that time, deprogramming might have been considered, a danger. But when I hear the story, I sometimes wonder whether people would consider it as a threat, this example, because the kidnappers were her parents. So whether she would have actually been in danger, because it's sometimes hard to believe that a parent would actually not, even though they were deprogramming her, just after that, those kind of things that went on, whether she was in danger, because a parent would never really go to that extent, usually.
Yeah, usually they were, if parents were unfavorable, they didn't go to the extent of kidnapping their daughter or son. But it did happen in this case. And the result of this story is, or part of the result is that she filed another lawsuit against the parents and against her own parents and her own sister and brother. And she won from them several thousands of dollars because the court ruled that it was actually a kidnapping case, even though they were relatives. And then later on, she's 69 now, later on, she had a sort of rapprochement, or a meeting of the minds with her parents and brother and sister, brother-in-law and sister, and they decided what they had done was actually not correct, because she had the right to believe everything she believed. So these things did happen, and somehow the brother, over time, they can be seen as being benevolent, even though the parents meant well, but they did something that was wrong, and they spent money for it, a lot of money.
Thank you.
So anything else? Okay, we'll end there. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Bhagavatam Maharaj ki